According to ancient sources, there are names that behave less like places and more like mirrors. They do not sit quietly on the map. They move through the mind, gathering meaning as they pass from one generation to the next. Atlantis is one of those names. It arrives wrapped in the drama of disappearance, yet it endures with the stubbornness of something half-remembered. For centuries, it has been treated like a riddle with a single answer, a dot to be found in the ocean, a city to be uncovered beneath silt and salt. And yet, it is possible that Atlantis was never meant to be a single city at all. It may have been something far larger, far older, and far more complex, a continent, not a metropolis, a realm, not a ruin. An entire world, mistaken for a myth because the world that remembered it no longer had the words to describe it. If Atlantis was remembered rather than recorded, then the story we inherited is not a report, but an echo. Myths, in that light, are not lies. They are what survives when the details cannot. They are the shapes left behind when the facts are worn away by catastrophe and time. A myth does not preserve a photograph of the past. It preserves an outline, a silhouette. It preserves the emotional truth of an event, the awe of a technology, the terror of a flood, the reverence for ancestors who seemed like gods. The mind of a civilization cannot store everything. It stores what it must. It stores what hurts, what warns, what inspires. And in that storage, memory becomes symbol. Symbol becomes story. Story becomes legend. Legend becomes, eventually, a name spoken with a smile of disbelief until someone notices how many different peoples, separated by oceans and ages, seem to be telling the same story in different tongues. There is a reason Atlantis refuses to fade. The name is a hook. It catches on the imagination because it hints at a world behind our world, a buried chapter, not a future promised, but a past denied. And perhaps that is the most unsettling possibility of all, that Atlantis represents not an invented paradise, but a lost inheritance. That it was not the first place humans dreamed of, but the first place humans forgot. Plato, of course, is the doorway through which most modern minds enter the legend. Into Dialogues Timaeus and Critias he offers a tale of an island kingdom beyond the pillars of Heracles, rich, powerful, and ultimately annihilated in a single dreadful day and night. Many have read him as a geographer in disguise, and have spent lifetimes trying to pin his description to a particular seabed. But Plato was a philosopher, not a cartographer. He used stories as instruments, shaping them to illuminate moral and political ideas. Yet even if Plato adapted the account, it is possible that he did not invent it from nothing. According to his own telling, he inherited it through Solon from Egyptian priests, who claimed to guard records of events far older than Greek memory. Some researchers speculate that this detail is not a flourish, but a clue. Ancient Egypt was obsessive about continuity. It preserved lists of kings, it preserved rituals, it preserved sacred forms, it remembered, and if a catastrophe once reordered the world, Egypt, sheltered by desert and river, might have been among the few places where fragments of a previous age could survive as records rather than rumors. In that view, Plato's Atlantis becomes less a creation of imagination and more a translation of an older tradition, reshaped to fit Greek speech and Greek thought. But translation is never perfect. When a story crosses languages, it crosses realities. Words for landscape, for measurement, for governance, for divine order, these are not universal. A king in one culture is not a king in another. An island can be a continent, depending on where the storyteller stands. The sea itself can be described differently by people who know coasts, and by people who have never crossed an ocean. Plato may have received a vast and ancient memory and reduced it into a form his audience could hold. He may have compressed an entire world into a narrative that fit in the palm of a dialogue. Consider the most persistent limitation of the popular image, a single city sinking beneath the waves. Great civilizations, even in our recorded history, do not confine themselves to one shining capital and did nothing else. They spread, they build ports and farms and roads. They raise temples in one region and fortresses in another. They speak in many accents, They develop rival schools of thought. They contain internal migrations, disputes, alliances, and cultural variations. A civilization advanced enough to astonish the ancient world would not have been a solitary ring city on an island, isolated and complete. It would have been a network. It would have been a continent of many faces. A lost continent suggests something more believable in scale and more haunting in consequence. Imagine not a single city swallowed by the ocean, but a broad landmass, mountains and plains, inland seas and river valleys, forests and deserts sustaining millions over centuries. Imagine multiple regions, each with its own dialect, its own style of stonework, its own gods or philosophies. Coastal cities facing the open ocean, built for wind and salt. Inland capitals surrounded by fields, designed for governance and learning. Sacred highlands where observatories watch the stars, not with modern instruments, but with precise alignments of stone and a mathematics carried in memory and ritual. In such a realm, knowledge would not be confined to one elite circle, it would have been distributed. Guilds of builders, schools of navigators, keepers of seasonal calendars, artisans who understood metallurgy not as industry, but as sacred craft. A continent that had mastered its environment would have done so through accumulated experience, building with the grain of the earth rather than against it. Shaping watercourses, terracing hillsides. Designing harbors that calmed the sea's violence. Raising architecture that endured storms by honoring the direction of wind and the weight of stone. Advanced does not need to mean mechanical. It can mean elegant. It can mean profoundly adapted. Some researchers speculate that the most impressive technologies of a vanished age might look, to us, like miracles of simplicity because the principles behind them were understood so deeply that complexity was unnecessary. A civilization could be advanced through precise stone cutting, through knowledge of acoustics and temples, through navigation by subtle patterns of stars and currents, through medicine grounded in plants and minerals, through agriculture tuned to microclimates, through engineering that used geometry as a language spoken fluently across generations. Imagine their ships. Not the crude rafts of early coastal peoples, but vessels engineered for long voyages, keels designed to cut deep water, sails woven from fibers treated against rot, hulls sealed with resins harvested and refined with care. Imagine navigators who read the sea like scripture, who understood that swells carry distant weather, that birds fly in predictable arcs toward land, that certain clouds gather above islands unseen beyond the horizon. Imagine a network of seafaring routes that linked the continent to far coasts, as predictable to them as roads are to us. Within this speculative Atlantis, engineering would have been a philosophy. Environmental mastery would not mean domination, but harmony, a deep attentiveness to the Earth's moods. They might have built canals that served both transport and irrigation, aligning them with natural gradients. They might have designed cities around water and wind, ensuring that streets cooled in summer and drained in storms. They might have used stone not merely as material, but as time, choosing it because it outlasts flesh, and because civilizations that think in centuries build differently than civilizations that think in seasons. If such a continent existed, it would not have been invisible to the rest of the world. Its people would have moved outward. They would have traded, they would have explored. They would have encountered smaller coastal communities and inland tribes. And in those encounters, influence would have flowed like tide water into river mouths, leaving behind traces that later cultures would remember without understanding their origin. Some researchers speculate that the sudden flowering of monumental architecture in various parts of the ancient world, the shared obsession with aligned stones, the recurring sacred geometries, the mythic emphasis on first teachers arriving from the sea could be interpreted not as proof, but as a pattern. Not evidence of one origin, but an invitation to consider the possibility of contact, of diffusion, of a vanished maritime civilization leaving fragments behind. If Atlanteans traveled widely, their collapse would not erase their influence, it would scatter it. It would turn a coherent tradition into 1,000 broken pieces embedded in local cultures like foreign jewels set into new crowns. In one land, a stranger arrives and teaches measurement and becomes a god of wisdom. In another, a survivor speaks of a drowned homeland, and the story becomes a flood myth. In another, skilled builders appear briefly, raise a stone sanctuary, and then vanish, leaving behind an architecture the locals imitate for centuries without knowing the original methods. The survivors would not bring entire libraries. They would bring skills carried in hands, songs carried in breath, symbols carved into small objects, and stories that served as both comfort and warning. If Atlantis was remembered rather than recorded, then what we call gods in early myth might sometimes be ancestors seen through the lens of trauma and awe. Founders become divine because their knowledge felt supernatural to those who received it. Heroes become larger than life because they survived what should have killed everyone. The civilizing strangers in ancient traditions, those who arrive from the sea, those who teach agriculture, law, writing, and star lore could be distorted memories of displaced Atlanteans. Not literal immortals, but human beings burdened with the last remnants of a greater world. Yet to accept a continent-level Atlantis is to accept a far darker implication. For such a continent to vanish, the catastrophe could not have been local. It would have been planetary in consequence, or at least dramatic enough to be felt across oceans. And here the story turns from wonder to dread. The Earth is not still. It only seems still on the scale of a human life. Beneath every step is a restlessness older than memory. Plates drift, faults lock and slip. Volcanoes build mountains with patience and destroy them in a day. The ocean rises and falls over millennia, swallowing coastlines so slowly that generations forget the land was ever wider. And sometimes, rarely but certainly, the Earth makes a sudden, violent correction and event so immense it becomes a scar in collective memory. According to ancient sources, floods once covered the world, seas climbed, lands broke. Fires fell from the sky, mountains trembled. These are common motifs across distant mythologies, from river valleys to island chains. Some researchers speculate that such myths preserve memories of real events at the end of the last ice age, when meltwater pulses raised sea levels dramatically. Others point to seismic cataclysms, to volcanic winters, to the possibility of massive earthquakes and tsunamis that could obliterate entire coastlines. And it is possible that Atlantis, if it was a continent or a major landmass, sat on a region of geological instability and intersection of faults, a place where the Earth's crust is thin, a place where the sea is always waiting. Imagine the final hours of such a world, not a slow decline, not a gradual abandonment, but a sudden unraveling. The first sign is not an earthquake, but an absence. The sea withdraws unnaturally from the shore, exposing rocks and kelp like bare ribs. Animals behave strangely, birds flee inland, dogs howl. Then comes the sound of low groan rising from beneath the ground, a pressure like the world holding its breath. The earth shudders, stone walls crack. Temples lose their balance, bridges twist, wells turn brackish. In the distance, the ocean's horizon darkens, not with clouds, but with a moving wall. The first wave does not simply crash, it invades. It sweeps through harbors, lifts ships like toys, throws them into streets. It smashes wooden homes, pries stones apart, fills plazas with mud and dead fish. People run to higher ground, carrying children, carrying relics, carrying nothing at all because there is no time. Then the ground convulses again, fissures open. Entire sections of coastline slump and slide. In some places, the land seems to liquefy, as if the earth itself has become water. If Atlantis was a continent, its destruction might not have been a single sinkhole swallowing a city, but a sequence of disasters cascading across regions. Earthquakes triggering landslides, landslides triggering tsunamis. Volcanoes awakening, ash darkening the sky. Storms gathering from altered pressures. Rivers reversing, lakes bursting their banks. Coastal plains drowning, and beneath all of it, the slow, terrible shift of tectonic plates, an unseen hand tilting the world. In this scenario, parts of Atlantis could fracture rather than vanish completely. Islands might remain, jagged remnants of mountain ranges. Submerged plateaus might lie hidden beneath deep water, covered by sediment like burial shrouds. What once were valleys might now be under kilometers of sea. What once were cities might now be rubble fields scattered by currents and buried by time. Survivors would have been few, and survival would have been exile. They would have fled not with certainty, but with desperation. They would have boarded ships in storming seas. They would have clung to driftwood. They would have crossed distances they had once navigated for trade, now navigating for life. They would have arrived on foreign shores thin as ghosts, speaking a language that sounded like the wind in ruined halls. And those who received them would have struggled to understand. How does a coastal tribe comprehend a visitor who speaks of a homeland larger than any land they have ever seen? How does an inland people imagine a continent swallowed? How does a culture without writing preserve the account of a global catastrophe? It does what humans have always done. It transforms terror into story, so the mind can carry it without breaking. It turns survivors into culture heroes. It turns vanished cities into underworld kingdoms. It turns the sea into a jealous god. It turns geological violence into divine judgment, because that is the only language grand enough to explain why the world suddenly changed. If Atlantis was remembered rather than recorded, then the survivors' accounts could become the bones of myths that later civilizations considered sacred. The flood becomes a story of cleansing and rebirth. The sinking becomes a moral tale of pride punished. The lost continent becomes a paradise fallen. Over time, names shift, directions blur. The original location becomes irrelevant. The emotional truth remains. The warning remains. The ache remains. Then comes the inevitable modern objection. If such a continent existed, where is the proof? The ocean is not a museum, it is a machine of erasure. It breaks, grinds, dissolves, and buries. Salt eats metal. Currents move sediment like relentless hands sweeping a floor. Marine life colonizes ruins and turns sharp edges into rounded shapes. Earthquakes reshuffle the seabed. Volcanic deposits cover older layers. What survives underwater rarely survives in recognizable form unless it is extraordinarily protected, extraordinarily recent, or extraordinarily fortunate. Even on land, time is a predator. Cities collapse into foundations. Foundations vanish beneath soil. Forests reclaim stone, rivers change course. Ice grinds mountains into dust, and human beings, when they find remnants of the past, often reuse them. Stones become new walls, statues become lime, temples become quarries. The absence of proof is not proof of absence. It is only a reminder of how little of the ancient world remains intact. Some researchers speculate that physical traces of Atlantis, if any exist, would be misunderstood rather than recognized. A submerged structure could be dismissed as a natural formation. An anomalous artifact could be mislabeled, its context lost. A pattern of aligned stones could be attributed to later cultures because we prefer continuity over interruption. Our histories are built like clean staircases. Reality is often a shattered cliff. And if Atlantis was not a single city, but an entire continent, then proof would not be a single dramatic ruin. It would be subtle, repeated anomalies, mismatched chronologies, technologies appearing too early and then disappearing, myths sharing uncommon details across great distances, cultural motifs that emerge like reflections of the same forgotten source. Proof might be not a monument, but a mosaic. And mosaics are easy to misread when most of the tiles are missing. There is also the possibility, quieter but more unsettling, that an advanced Atlantis would have built in ways that do not resemble what we expect. We look for towering stone cities because stone survives. But a civilization could be advanced and still build much of its world from wood, earth, and fiber materials that vanish almost entirely, leaving only faint traces. We look for inscriptions because writing preserves thought, but a civilization might have carried knowledge through oral traditions, through apprenticeships, through memory palaces built in the mind, leaving little carved text behind. The greatest libraries of such a world could have been living people. When the people died, the libraries burned without flame. To consider Atlantis as a continent is to consider it as a stage upon which humanity first rehearsed a truly global identity. Atlantis, in this speculation, was not merely wealthy or militarily powerful. It was connected internally across its regions and externally across seas. It may have been humanity's first attempt at a planetary culture, not in the modern sense of instant communication, but in the ancient sense of shared roots, shared measures, shared celestial references, and shared symbols that travelers recognized in distant ports.